What if the world you think began with fire, and dinosaurs actually began in the silence that followed their annihilation? What if the story you were taught, the neat line from asteroid impact to mammals, from mammals to humans, was only a fragile outline drawn on top of something older, deeper, and far more unsettling? Picture a planet bruised and broken, its skies blackened, its oceans poisoned, its continents trembling under the weight of extinction. Not a metaphor. An Earth so wounded that almost all record of what rose next has been swallowed, erased, crushed under time itself. Because after the global firestorms faded and the long night of impact winter lifted, there should have been a clear story. Life should have rebuilt itself step by step, leaving evidence like footprints in wet clay. But instead, the trail vanishes. Entire chapters of Earth's rebirth simply aren't there. The fossil beds go silent. The rocks turn empty. It's as if the planet tried to hide the moment life reinvented itself, burying the clues that explain how we went from small, trembling survivors scurrying under fallen logs to the architects of the modern world. This isn't a gap. It's a chasm, a missing bridge between destruction and creation, a place where science can only guess and time refuses to speak. And the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. Because whatever rose in that darkness didn't just survive, it transformed the entire planet, and eventually it became us. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. In the beginning, at least the beginning we're allowed to see, the world is quiet. Not peaceful, not healed, just quiet in the way a battlefield is quiet after the smoke stops rising. The catastrophe has already happened. The sky that once burned like a furnace has cooled, the ash storms have settled, and the long winter that swallowed the sun has thinned enough for dim light to return. The asteroid strike, the one that tore open the Yucatan and turned forests into cinders, is no longer the headline. Now the story enters its strangest and most hidden chapter. The rebirth that should have left clear fingerprints, but instead dissolves into silence. Imagine standing on that planet. The air isn't fresh, it's metallic, heavy with the scent of scorched minerals. The ground feels unstable underfoot because it is. It's been torn, overturned, burned, buried, cracked, drowned, and frozen within a violent span of days and years. Nothing about this landscape is stable. Nothing about it is predictable. In every direction, you see reminders of what was. Trunkless forests, coastline carved by tsunamis so large they scraped entire regions clean. Plains where the bones of giants lie bleaching under a cold, pale sun. Yet this wasteland is the cradle of something new. And that new should have left a trail. But instead, it has left one of the most deafening absences in all of natural history. Life, battered and trembling, crawls back into the world. Not with confidence, but with desperation. Small mammals, creatures that once lived in the shadows under the rule of enormous reptiles, now navigate a world stripped of its familiar predators. They don't rise heroically. They simply endure. They burrow into the warmth of the earth, picking through the ruins for seeds, insects, anything to keep living for one more day. Their eyes peer out from hollows in fallen logs, watching a world that doesn't yet belong to them and doesn't yet know what to make of them. They don't realize they've inherited an empty throne. They only know the sky is still dim, the nights still too long, and the land still too quiet. The plants come next. First the ferns, always the ferns. Those botanical first responders that sprout like green ghosts after every catastrophe. They reclaim the ground in great sweeping blankets, spreading their spores into soil enriched by ash. In the layers of rock that scientists study millions of years later, this explosion of fern spores becomes a signature, the mark of a world relearning how to breathe. But after that, the data begins to thin. The fossil record, normally generous after major transitions, suddenly skips. Ferns appear, then nothing. Then different plants show up later, evolved into new forms, adapted to new climates. But the steps between those appearances are gone. It's as if Earth itself refuses to reveal how the living world reassembled. As though the pages recording those centuries were ripped out. And mammals, those future architects of everything yet to come, are the biggest mystery of all. They should have left bones everywhere, not just because they survived, but because they multiplied rapidly to fill ecological roles left vacant by the mass extinction. When an entire megafauna disappears, evolution accelerates. New species should branch off like wildfire. The ground should be littered with the evidence of rapid adaptation. But instead, scientists find fragments, a tooth here, a jawbone there, occasional skeletons that seem to appear out of nowhere without the expected predecessors. It's an evolutionary jump cut, a timeline spliced together with missing reels. You can picture those early mammals emerging from their burrows after weeks or months of darkness, blinking at a world slowly warming. They sniff the air, testing scents unfamiliar and unsettling. The forests they once knew are gone. The underbrush is replaced by charred stumps, fallen trunks, hollows left by trees whose roots were vaporized. But in the distance, new shoots appear, thin, tentative, fighting their way toward the weak sunlight. The mammals go to them not because they understand the world is changing, but because instinct guides them to any source of food, any reason to hope. From these humble survivors, everything unfolds. Predators, herbivores, climbers, swimmers, eventually primates, eventually oos. But the transition should be visible. Instead, the evidence dissolves into dust. Scientists call this period the Paleocene. But the name doesn't matter. What matters is the emptiness. It's not just a gap in fossils, it's a blackout. A century of paleontologists and geologists have tried to illuminate it, brushing sediment from bone fragments, decoding isotopes in ancient clay, comparing species from sites continents apart. But they keep running into the same invisible wall. The world before the extinction is clear. The world after, millions of years later, is clear. But the first few million years following the asteroid's impact, they might as well be stored in a locked room beneath the planet's crust. Part of the issue is preservation. Fossils form when organisms die in the right environment, buried quickly, protected from scavengers, surrounded by sediment rich in minerals. But after the asteroid, stability vanished. Floods scoured river valleys. Landslides buried entire hillsides. Lake basins drained and refilled. Sea levels shifted violently as climates swung between extremes. The planet, trying to heal itself, erased its own memories, and life, struggling through one crisis after another, was too sparse, too scattered, too fragile to leave the dense record preserved from calmer eras. Picture a family of small mammals, rat-sized, trembling, scavenging. When they die, their bones don't rest in peaceful soil. They're torn apart by predators, swept downstream by floods, buried under ash from volcanic activity triggered by the impact itself. They don't fossilize, they vanish. Multiply this by millions of individuals, millions of years, and the silence becomes clearer. Not intentional, just inevitable. Yet the mystery isn't only in the missing remains. It's also in what should be present, but isn't. When species diversify rapidly, they leave transitional forms, stages with half-adapted features, in-between limbs, teeth shaped for diets not yet perfected. These are evolution's breadcrumbs. But in the Paleocene, breadcrumbs evaporate. Instead, we find animals millions of years later that seem fully formed, as if they stepped onto the stage without rehearsal. Primitive hoofed mammals appear with no visible path behind them. Early predators emerge with traits too advanced for the fossil trail to make sense. Primate ancestors materialize with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, tools of an arboreal life. Yet the forests they would have needed aren't recorded anywhere. And because the fossil beds can't answer the questions multiply. What if the world that rose after the disaster wasn't simply rebuilding itself, but rewriting itself? Not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that environments shifted so violently, so unpredictably, that evolution leapt rather than crawled. Bottlenecks compress genetic variation, forcing species to reinvent themselves rapidly. The survivors, those few lucky enough to have the right traits, expand into roles they were never meant to fill. Some lineages disappear as quickly as they arise. Their time on Earth measured in thousands of years rather than millions, leaving too little imprint for us to find. Imagine an early mammal species that develops slightly stronger jaws, allowing it to eat the tough new plants that dominate the post-extinction world. For a few hundred generations, it thrives, its population expands, it fills a niche no other creature can. Then the climate shifts again, the forests change, the advantage disappears. The species goes extinct almost as soon as it appears, leaving behind nothing but a few scattered bones that decay before they ever reach the ground, stable enough to preserve them. Multiply that by thousands of failed branches, and the picture becomes clearer. Evolution's great branching tree looks more like a burned forest. Most trunks never make it to adulthood. Only a few reach the future. Then the climate changes again, and again. Earth becomes a planet in flux. Fern prairies give way to the early rise of flowering plants. Forests regrow in patterns unlike the ones that preceded them. Atmospheric carbon levels fluctuate. Volcanic eruptions in what is now India release massive plumes of gases that warm the atmosphere. Oceans absorb and redistribute heat. Weather becomes wild and unpredictable. In this chaos, the survivors adapt quickly. Some grow larger. Others become agile climbers. Others develop flexible diets. Mammals radiate into ecological roles with a speed rarely witnessed in the fossil record. But all of this happens under conditions that do not favor preservation. And so the record stays empty. But emptiness itself is a clue. When rock layers go blank, they reveal more than they hide. They show us intervals of upheaval, periods when landscapes were too unstable to capture the details of life, periods when evolution ran faster than sediment could record, periods when ecosystems were so fragile, so transient, that they vanished before they could be locked in stone. This is the Paleocene, the world after the end of the world. a time when the planet reinvented itself in near secrecy, a time when life redrew the blueprint for everything that would follow, a time when tiny, insignificant mammals seized the greatest opportunity in evolutionary history, stepping into the void left by the dinosaurs with no witnesses and no chroniclers to preserve the moment. We live in the shadow of that silence. Human existence descends from the survivors of that hidden age. Every primate, every mammal, every species that thrived in the millions of years that followed owes its lineage to creatures whose bones no longer exist, whose stories were erased by disaster and rebirth. The Paleocene is not an empty chapter. It's the lost prologue to the rise of the modern world. And understanding it requires accepting a simple truth. Not everything in Earth's past will ever be found. Some stories are too fragile for stone, too chaotic for sediment, too brief for immortality. But the echoes remain in our bones, in our DNA, in the evolutionary leaps that seem impossible without the crucible of catastrophe. This is where our long, mysterious ascent truly begins. In a world that refused to preserve its own rebirth, yet somehow gave rise to every wonder that followed. The world that emerged after the Paleocene was not a gentle continuation of recovery. It was something stranger, an Earth experimenting with itself, reshaping continents, climates, and creatures as though trying to decide what kind of planet it wanted to be. By the time the next major chapter began, the stage had warped into a place that would feel almost alien to us, yet foundational to everything humanity would eventually inherit. This new epoch, the Eocene, did not arrive quietly. It arrived like a fever sweeping across the world, saturating everything in heat, moisture, and impossible abundance. But even abundance can be deceptive, especially when the fossil record whispers more questions than answers. Imagine Earth 40 to 50 million years after the asteroid impact. Instead of ice caps, the poles are lush with vegetation. Instead of the frozen Arctic we know, imagine a warm sea bordered by evergreen forests, where creatures resembling crocodiles glide through waters as mild as modern California beaches. Imagine palm trees swaying where tundra will someday lie. The world is hot, unimaginably so. Not desert heat, but the thick, humid heat of a greenhouse stretched across an entire planet. The temperature gradient that separates equator from poles is faint, barely noticeable. Seasons are shadows of themselves. Rainforests sprawl across continents in dense, tangled layers of canopy and vines. Rivers surge with life, and nearly every niche that can be filled is filled. This should be one of the clearest periods in Earth's history. A world teeming with life should leave an abundance of evidence. Yet again, the Earth is stingy. Fossils appear in bursts, followed by long silences. Whole lineages rise and fall offstage, leaving only traces. The lush forests, for all their vitality, are terrible record keepers. In the heat and moisture, bodies decay in days. Acidic soil dissolves bone. Plant matter grows over the dead and consumes them before they can fossilize. A world full of life leaves almost nothing behind. But from the fragments we do have, the Eocene emerges as a world of evolutionary experiments, many successful for a time, but ultimately doomed, vanishing without descendants. Some of the creatures that dominated the Eocene have no modern analogues, no surviving relatives, no evolutionary successor to carry their story forward. Take the creodonts, for example. They were the apex predators of this greenhouse Earth. powerful carnivores occupying the roles modern lions, wolves, and big cats would eventually claim. Some were massive, with jaws capable of crushing bone. Others were smaller, stalking through underbrush with sleek bodies built for ambush. But, anatomically, they were not related to the carnivores we know today. They were an entirely separate lineage, a side branch of evolution that thrived for millions of years before disappearing so completely that their extinction feels almost theatrical, like a curtain dropping before the next act. Then there were the Brontotheres, enormous herbivores that roamed North America and Asia. Picture massive, rhinoceros-like beasts with elaborate horns branching from their skulls. Some species weighed several tons, towering above the dense foliage they fed upon. Their footprints once pressed deep into the mud of ancient floodplains, yet the path that led to them and the path that led away is blurred by geological erasure. They appear suddenly in the fossil record, already massive and specialized, and they vanish just as suddenly tens of millions of years later when cooling climates reset the board again. This pattern repeats endlessly in the Eocene. Life blooms fast, diversifies even faster, then is swept away by forces the fossil record barely hints at. But nowhere is the mystery deeper than in the story of early primates, the ancestors of monkeys, apes, and eventually humans. Their earliest forms appear as small, tree-dwelling creatures with grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and bodies adapted to navigating dense canopies. They likely lived in humid forests dense enough to block sunlight. They thrived in ecosystems that reshaped themselves constantly. But the evidence of their evolution is fragmentary. Their bones show up suddenly in Eocene layers, already bearing the hallmark traits of primates, with no clear record of how they arrived there. Somewhere in those unincluded layers of rock, the ones eroded away by shifting rivers, swallowed by rising seas, or buried by tectonic uplift, are the ancestors we will never see. The ones who first lifted their faces to the sunlight filtering through the ancient canopy. The ones whose fingers curled around branches with a dexterity that hinted at a future species capable of building tools and crafting civilizations. But those early primates are lost to time. Their skulls and bones dissolved into soil before mineral water could transform them into stone. The Eocene world, for all its heat, is also marked by astonishing transitions. Early whales appear in this epoch, not yet fully aquatic, but caught mid-transformation, with limbs still capable of walking on land. Their fossils, when found, tell a story of mammals venturing back into the water after tens of millions of years of terrestrial life. But the steps between land mammal and ocean giant are fractured, obscured by missing layers that should show how hind limbs shrank, how internal structures shifted, how lungs adapted for deep dives. Like so much in the Eocene, the evolutionary script is written in a mixture of detailed scenes and blank pages. And yet, despite the world being a greenhouse paradise, something begins to shift, slowly at first, then with alarming speed. Temperatures rise even more. Carbon dioxide concentrations spike. Volcanoes in what is now modern-day Asia and Africa release enormous plumes of greenhouse gases. Forests expand northward. Ocean chemistry changes. The planet warms further until it hits a fever pitch. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a climate event so extreme that average global temperatures soared by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in a geological instant. It is one of the most dramatic warming events in Earth's history, a precursor to later collapses, and a mirror, an unsettling one, to today's warming. But even in this global fever, the fossil record goes quiet when we most need it to speak. Species shrink in size, a known response to extreme heat. Others migrate poleward. New primate species appear as older ones vanish. Yet the details of how they adapted remain blurred. Fossils from this critical window are few and far between, and the ones we find are like snapshots torn from a larger album. Imagine a family of early primates fleeing a forest turning too hot, migrating north toward regions that once would have been inhospitable. The trees grow shorter. The canopy opens. The fruits they relied upon grow scarce. They adapt. They evolve smaller bodies shed heat easier. They refine their senses for survival in an ecosystem transformed. But none of that is preserved. All that remains are hints, skulls with slight modifications to their snouts or eye sockets, teeth showing subtle changes in diet. We know they moved, we know they changed, but the path they took is invisible. Layer after layer of Eocene sediment should record these changes. Instead, many of those layers never formed or were destroyed. Tropical forests, as vibrant as they are, rarely fossilize their inhabitants. The heat, moisture, and constant turnover of life eliminate the remains before they can be buried. The very forests that nurtured early primates ensured their stories would be largely erased. Meanwhile, Earth continues reshaping itself. India collides with Asia, raising the Himalayas. Sea levels shift, continental shelves deepen, altering currents. Ocean temperatures rise. Regions of once stable ecosystems destabilize. Species flourish and perish in rapid cycles. Through it all, mammals transform, experimenting with size, shape, and behavior. But the patterns we expect, gradual transitions, steady lines of descent, fracture into evolutionary mosaics. A small hoofed mammal becomes a larger grazing creature. But instead of seeing the gradual enlargement of bones across thousands of generations, we see only an early form, a later form, and nothing in between. It's as if Earth refuses to let us see the slow steps, only the beginning and the end, and perhaps that's fitting. The Eocene was not a world of slow changes. It was a world constantly reinventing itself. Forests expanded, then shrank. Seas warmed, then cooled slightly. Volcanoes erupted, changing atmospheric chemistry. The planet experienced swings so dramatic that species were often forced to evolve or die within spans too short to be captured in stone. Yet for all the instability, this was a world filled with unimaginable beauty. A world where primates leapt through trees at the poles, where early horses the size of small dogs darted between giant ferns, where lush canopies blocked out so much sunlight that the ground was permanently shadowed. A world that produced creatures we would struggle even to categorize today. Animals that belonged to evolutionary stories that ended abruptly, never contributing to the later chapters that lead to us. When the Eocene finally neared its end, the Earth began cooling again. Slowly at first, then sharply. Antarctica drifted toward the South Pole and began to freeze. Sea levels shifted, rainforests retreated, open woodlands expanded. The extinction of the brontotheres and creodonts marked a turning point. Predators and herbivores alike were forced to adapt to new ecosystems that resembled savannas more than jungles. Early primates scattered, some migrating to Asia and Africa, where forests remained thick enough to support them, others fading from the fossil record entirely as their habitats disappeared. The worlds that followed would set the stage for the evolution of apes and eventually humans. But even as the Eocene collapses into the next epoch, the details blur again. Fossil beds from the transitional period are often incomplete, eroded, or buried deep beneath continents that lifted as tectonic forces reshaped the world. We know forests thinned. We know grasslands spread. We know mammals diversified yet again. But the exact sequences, the intricate interplay between species, and the precise paths that led from early primates to the ancestors of apes remain smeared across the geological record like wet paint. What survives of the Eocene story are fragments of worlds long gone: jawbones, teeth, the occasional skull, fossil leaves pressed into stone, showing forests unlike anything alive today, rare deposits preserving insect wings or fish skeletons from ancient lakes. From these fragments, we reconstruct a world that feels too vivid to be imaginary, yet too incomplete to fully comprehend. The Eocene is the dawn of the modern mammalian world. It is the furnace in which the traits that would someday define primates, and eventually humans, were forged. But its story is written on pages half erased by time, told through fossils that survive only by miracle. And so this epoch stands as both revelation and riddle. The world was warm, vibrant, overflowing with life, and yet nearly invisible to us. A chapter that reshaped the planet, but left behind only scattered clues. A time when evolution sprinted ahead while the sediment stood still. A world that built the foundations of our lineage while hiding the blueprints in layers that no longer exist. The Eocene is not just a period in Earth's past. It is a vanished world, a forgotten greenhouse Eden where many evolutionary dreams lived and died without witness. And tracking those missing stories is not simply about ancient ecosystems. It is about uncovering the roots of ourselves. By the time the Eocene slipped into the Oligocene, the Earth had begun a transformation so abrupt and unforgiving that it reshaped the destiny of every lineage still clinging to the planet. The world that had once been a sweltering greenhouse, lush, humid, overflowing with dense forests, began to cool. Not gently, not leisurely, but with a severity that fractured ecosystems and forced life into choices it had never faced before. This cooling marked more than the end of an epoch. It marked the beginning of a long, cold pruning of life's experiments. The world was changing its rules again, and this time, evolution was not invited to play gently. Antarctica, which had drifted toward the South Pole like a wandering giant for millions of years, finally locked into place. As it settled, ocean currents reorganized around it. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current formed, a massive belt of water spinning unbroken around the continent, isolating it from warm tropical seas. It was a climate switch, a turning point written in temperature instead of stone. Once the current stabilized, Antarctica froze, and the ice did not stop growing. It crawled across the land like a white tide, feeding on the planet's moisture and reflecting sunlight back into space. Global temperatures fell. Rainforests shrank. Grasslands crept outward. The world became sharper, harsher, and more divided by season. This new climate should have left behind a wealth of fossils documenting the transition. But once again, we find interruptions, gaps where whole ecosystems should be. The Oligocene is notorious for what it does not show. Ancient forests vanished without a trace. Lakebeds that might have recorded entire chapters of mammalian evolution cracked, eroded or sank into tectonic rubble. The animals of this period lived, adapted, thrived, competed, and died. But the Earth swallowed most of their remains before they had time to fossilize. What little we do uncover feels more like scattered puzzle pieces than chapters in a coherent story. And yet, from the fragments, a pattern emerges, one that is both astonishing and unsettling. Mammals were diversifying faster than ever, but the fossil record refuses to show us how. It reveals endpoints without beginnings, descendants without ancestors, sudden appearances without the transitions we expect. This was an era of evolutionary speed, driven by climate upheaval, but the Earth preserved only glimpses of the outcomes. Consider the first true apes. They emerged somewhere between the late Eocene and the early Oligocene, a lineage that would eventually give rise to gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and humans. But the fossils documenting their earliest steps are practically non-existent. A few teeth, a fragment of a jaw, an ankle bone here, a wrist bone there. And yet, by the time the record becomes clearer millions of years later, apes are already spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia, diverse, adaptable, and clearly representing branches that must have taken shape during this poorly recorded window in time. Imagine the forests where these early apes lived, cooler than their Eocene predecessors, but still dense enough for complex canopy life. Picture small-bodied creatures with flexible shoulders and grasping hands, navigating branches that swayed under their weight. The leaves above them glisten with morning frost, a reminder of the cooling world. The fruits they once relied on year-round now appear only seasonally, forcing them to travel, experiment with new diets, explore new territories. These pressures shape their bodies. Their brains grow slightly larger. Their movements become more deliberate. Their communities become more complex. But none of this is recorded in stone. The forest floor is unforgiving, too acidic, too dynamic, too unstable to preserve their bones. What should have been the earliest chapters in the rise of apes dissolves into soil before time can claim it. Even more mysterious are the mammals that dominated the landscape during the Oligocene, but left no descendants. Creatures like the entelodonts, sometimes nicknamed hell pigs, though they were not pigs at all, stalked across plains with massive jaws and bone-crushing teeth. They thrived for millions of years, filling a predatory niche in a world where true carnivores were still experimenting with forms. But when climates changed again, they disappeared, leaving behind no lineage, no evolutionary legacy. Their bones, though striking when found, tell incomplete stories. They appear fully formed in the record, dominate briefly, and then vanish. The missing transitions in their rise mirror the missing transitions in their fall. The same is true for the Nimravids, the false saber-tooths. They resembled cats, hunted like cats, and carved out ecological roles similar to big cats, but they were not true felines. They were an evolutionary experiment parallel to carnivores, one that flourished during the Oligocene but eventually succumbed to competition, climate, or both. Their existence proves that nature does not evolve in straight lines. It evolves in spirals, branches, dead ends. Yet the fossil record for this period insists on withholding the full map. It shows us the Nimravids in their prime, but not the steps that brought them there. In the midst of these shifting ecosystems, grasslands began to spread. Not the sweeping savannas we know today, but early, tentative patches, open spaces where shrubs and hardy grasses replaced dense canopy. This transformation forced herbivores to adapt. Legs grew longer. Teeth strengthened. Eyes shifted to wider fields of view to better scan for predators across open ground. Predator and prey entered a new arms race, and evolution surged forward. But again, the fossil record lags behind. We see early forms and later forms, but the gradual adaptations between them often exist only as inference. It is tempting to imagine this world as chaotic, but in truth, it was extraordinarily structured, just structured in ways we no longer have access to. Predator territories carved invisible boundaries across plains. Herds migrated along routes now erased by erosion. Primate groups navigated shrinking forests, developing new strategies for survival. Every species, whether it thrived or perished, contributed to a complex web of interactions that defined the Oligocene world. But strip away the ecosystems, strip away the bones, strip away the land itself under the pressure of millions of years, and you are left with the haunting silence that frustrates scientists today. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Oligocene involves the early apes again, specifically how they spread. Fossils found in Europe and Asia suggest that they were far more widespread than expected, inhabiting regions that would eventually cool beyond their limits. They lived in forests that no longer exist, navigated climates unlike any found today, and competed with species whose evolutionary lineages would eventually vanish. But their dispersal routes are unknown. Did they migrate during brief warming intervals? Did land bridges open across regions now separated by vast seas? Or did their ancestors already inhabit multiple continents before the cooling began? The evidence is incomplete, leaving us to reconstruct their journey from hints rather than certainties. Yet, even with the gaps, the Oligocene world feels eerily alive when imagined through the fragments we do possess. A herd of early rhinoceroses, smaller than their modern counterparts but still formidable, grazes across a grassy patch near a river. Their ears twitch at the sound of distant pounding, the approach of entelodonts, whose heavy steps shake the dry earth. Above them, in a grove of trees that survived the cooling, small primates cling to branches, staring down at the commotion below. They sense danger in the way leaves quiver, in the low rumble of predators that roam the open lands. Nearby, a family of early carnivores, nimravids, stalks the edges of a clearing. Their movements are sleek, almost feline, their saber-like teeth glinting in the sunlight. They are efficient hunters, adapted to the new open habitats, yet their fossil record suggests they were already losing ground to more advanced carnivores from other lineages. Their reign will not last. But in this moment, in the imagined reconstruction of the world, they are at the height of their power. This was a world defined by transition between heat and cold, forest and grassland, ancient lineages and new innovations. It set the stage for what would come next: the rise of apes in earnest, the spread of grasslands, the refining of evolutionary pressures that would eventually sculpt the bodies, minds, and societies of future primates. But for now, in the Oligocene, everything is still in flux. Nothing is settled. Life is improvising, reacting, adapting to a climate that continues to swing unpredictably. The cooling is not smooth. It is punctuated by reversals, brief warming periods that allow forests to regain a foothold, followed by plunges that drive them back again. This cyclical instability ensures that no species becomes too comfortable, too specialized. The winners are those who can pivot quickly. Among those winners are the early ancestors of the line that will one day lead to humans. They are not remarkable yet. They are small-bodied, tree-dwelling, cautious. They leap across branches, forage for fruit, shelter in groups, raise their young with care and instinct. But their future is shaped here, in the turmoil of shifting forests. Their eyes grow more forward-facing for depth perception. Their hands grow more dexterous for navigating branches that sway unpredictably. Their brains grow incrementally larger as they solve the daily puzzles of survival in a landscape that changes like breath on glass. But then, the record dims again. For millions of years, we lose them. Fossils disappear, the narrative breaks, and by the time they reappear in clearer form millions of years later, they are changed. They are larger, more complex, spread across continents, branching into species that will eventually lead to great apes. But the story of how they made that leap is buried beneath layers of sediment long eroded away. It is a reminder that evolution does not unfold in tidy lines. It surges, collapses, and leaps. It hides entire chapters behind geological shifts and climate upheavals. And the Oligocene, this cool, transitional, perplexing epoch, is the bridge between two worlds, the greenhouse Earth of the Eocene and the more familiar landscapes of the Miocene, where apes flourish and begin the long march toward humanity. For now, all we can do is peer into the fog of missing evidence and imagine the countless stories that played out on this cooling Earth. Herds migrating across plains that no longer exist, predators adapting to open terrain, primates navigating shrinking forests, entire lineages rising and falling in silence. The Oligocene leaves us with fragments, but those fragments whisper of a world reinventing itself yet again, a world poised on the edge of a new age, one that will bring apes down from the trees and onto the stage where the fate of our lineage is decided. By the time the Miocene dawned, the Earth had already survived the furnace of the Eocene and the cold awakening of the Oligocene. But what came next was not simply another chapter. It was a revolution unfolding in slow motion across 30 million years. A world shedding forests, reshaping continents, and forcing life into new forms under a sun that rose over landscapes no longer cloaked in endless green. If the Eocene was a greenhouse, and the Oligocene was a cooling corridor, the Miocene was a workshop, a laboratory in which evolution experimented boldly, repeatedly, and with consequences that would ripple forward into the birth of humanity. The air is drier now. The once dominant rainforests retreat toward equatorial refuges, clinging to regions where moisture still gathers. In their place, woodlands and open savannas spread like golden cloth across the continents. Wind sweeps across tall grasses that never existed in earlier epochs, each blade a symbol of the world's new direction. The ecosystems that thrived in dense canopies, creatures of shadow, of rapid decay, of eternal summer, face a difficult decision: adapt to the open or vanish forever. And many vanish. Entire families of mammals, once abundant and diverse, fail to transition into the new world. Their fossils become geological punctuation marks, brief statements in stone, unconnected to the story that follows. Others adapt with surprising speed. Hoofed herbivores develop longer legs for endurance running. Their teeth change, toughening to grind the silica-rich grasses spreading across the plains. Predators alter their hunting styles, optimizing speed over stealth. Everywhere, the world is shifting toward openness, toward mobility, toward a life dictated by horizons rather than branches. Among those caught in this evolutionary reshuffling are the apes, the lineage destined to shape our future. But in the early Miocene, they are still experimental forms, scattered across Africa, Europe, and Asia, living varied lives in environments that no longer resemble the lush worlds of their Oligocene ancestors. Their story, like so many others, is written in fragments so small they barely qualify as evidence. A handful of teeth, femur shafts, scraps of jaw. And yet, from these remnants, we know they radiated into dozens of species, many of which left no descendants. Their branches on the tree of life sprouted beautifully and then snapped under the pressure of change. Imagine wandering through an early Miocene forest, sparser now, with shafts of sun piercing through thinner canopies. The air carries the dry scent of dust instead of the thick sweetness of decaying vegetation. In the branches above, an ape the size of a small child hangs upside down, its limbs strong but not yet shaped for true brachiation. Its call echoes through the forest, a song of warning or curiosity. Nearby, another species of ape, slightly larger, moves cautiously between trees, testing branches with careful hands. They share the forest with creatures that will seem bizarre to future eyes. Horned herbivores, shaped by climates in transition, sprinting predators whose bodies are still negotiating the balance between flexibility and strength. The apes of this era are adventurers without knowing it. Each species tests a different path, some becoming adept climbers, some learning to forage on the ground, some developing complex social behaviors, others fading into obscurity as conditions shift again. Climate change is relentless, and with each pulse of cooling or drying, forests shrink further, grasslands expand, and food sources transform. The apes, once creatures of abundance, must evolve new strategies. The fossil record offers few answers about how they did this. It shows us only their sporadic appearances, like spotlighted actors stepping briefly onto a stage before the scene cuts away. One fossil, then nothing for 1,000,000 years. Another fossil, but from a species so different that the lines between them blur. Scientists piece these fragments together like detectives working with shredded documents, trying to reconstruct the missing chapters. But the story keeps dissolving. For every discovery, there are thousands of bones that never fossilized, millions of individuals whose stories ended in dust and were erased by weather, scavengers, and time. Yet the Miocene was not only the age of transitions, it was the age of giants. While apes diversified in the trees and on the ground, other mammals reached extraordinary sizes. The largest land mammals ever known, creatures like Paraceratherium, roamed the plains, towering above the savannas like living mountains. These giants, with long necks and massive frames, browsed leaves from treetops, their movements slow and deliberate. They left footprints deep enough to survive in hardened sediments, giving us rare glimpses into the scale of life during this era. But even these titans could not escape the shifting climate. As grasslands expanded and forests dwindled, their food sources declined. Their massive bodies became burdens in a world demanding agility, endurance, and adaptability. Eventually they disappeared, leaving behind bones that would someday astonish researchers, but only as relics. No descendants, no survivors, just echoes of a world that could no longer sustain such giants. Meanwhile, the predators of the Miocene evolved new levels of sophistication. Early big cats, emerging from lineages distinct from earlier carnivores, refined their hunting skills on the sprawling grasslands. Some were ambush hunters, lying in wait near watering holes. Others relied on endurance, chasing prey across open plains. Their competition included giant hyenas, bear dogs, and nimravids still clinging to the shadow of their era. The fossil record again gives us glimpses: jaws with specialized teeth, limbs shaped for speed. But the dynamic interactions that played out over millions of years are lost to time. One of the most important transformations of this era, however, takes place on the level of ecosystems, not species. Grasslands do not merely replace forests, they restructure life itself. Grazers evolve herds, herds attract predators, predators refine strategies, complex mobility patterns emerge. Land becomes the stage for long-distance migration, shaping animals into forms optimized for movement rather than climbing or concealment. The open world is demanding, but it is also a crucible for innovation. Apes confront this challenge in unpredictable ways. Some cling to the remaining forests, adapting to life in shrinking refuges, where fruiting trees become more seasonal and competition grows fierce. Others inch toward a more terrestrial existence, occasionally venturing onto the ground to forage for seeds, insects, and roots. A few species begin experimenting with postures and locomotion that hint at the future. Their hands and feet, specialized for branching gripping, begin subtle transformations, changes in wrist mobility, shifts in finger proportions, slight adjustments in pelvic shape. These micro-adaptations accumulate, not suddenly, not in dramatic leaps, but gradually enough that they leave few definite fossils, yet profoundly enough that they alter the course of primate evolution. The continents themselves continue shifting. Africa edges closer to Eurasia until they eventually collide, forming land bridges that allow species to migrate between continents. Apes cross into Europe and Asia, encountering new climates, new predators, new food sources. Some thrive, others fail. But in this evolutionary churn, diversity explodes. Dozens of ape species inhabit the Old World, each adapted to a specific ecological niche: forest canopies, woodland edges, river valleys, mountain slopes. The fossil record suggests incredible variety, but it shows only the tip of an iceberg whose mass remains invisible. For every fossilized species, there were likely 6, 10, maybe more, that we will never know existed. The Earth was alive with primate experimentation, each success and failure shaping the groundwork for what would ultimately become hominins. But then, another cooling wave arrives. Gradual at first, then more severe. The forests retreat even further. Grasslands expand more aggressively than before. Europe cools. Asia shifts toward harsher seasons. The ape populations that once flourished across these continents begin to dwindle. Their bones, often left in environments where fossilization is unlikely, vanish into the soil. The diversity that marked the Middle Miocene collapses into selective pockets of survival. Those pockets are found primarily in Africa and parts of Asia, regions where warm climates preserve enough forest to sustain primate life. The apes that survive this transition are the ancestors of modern great apes, but their path forward remains obscured by the fossil record's silence. The ancestors of gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans hide within millions of years of missing sediment. their branching paths detectable only through genetic inference. We know they must have existed because their descendants exist, but their bones, those crucial pieces of evidence, remain lost. Meanwhile, the earth continues shifting. Mountain ranges rise, lakes form and evaporate, rivers carve new channels into bedrock. The world becomes a patchwork of microclimates, producing evolutionary puzzles that defy linear storytelling. A troop of early apes might occupy a forested valley where fruit remains abundant, their lives stable and predictable. A few miles away, another troop struggles in a drier woodland, forced to travel farther, to innovate diets, to communicate more effectively. The pressures they face reshape their bodies and minds. Perhaps their young learn to manipulate twigs to pry insects from crevices. Perhaps their social interactions become more nuanced as cooperation becomes essential for survival. But all of this, these crucial developments in the story of primate cognition, happens out of sight, unrecorded by fossils, lost to erosion. Again and again, the Miocene teaches a lesson we often resist. Evolution's most important steps frequently occur in silence. As the epoch draws toward its end, a pivotal event unfolds. Africa and Eurasia remain connected, but environmental changes isolate populations of apes into fragmented habitats. Diversity dwindles. Some lineages disappear entirely, including species that might have been close cousins to our own ancestors. Others persist, adapting to a world where forests have become patchy islands rather than vast continents of green. In East Africa, tectonic forces begin pulling the region apart, creating rift valleys where lakes rise and fall with erratic frequency. These shifting landscapes expose primates to environments radically different from those their ancestors had known. Volcanic activity reshapes the terrain. Streams carve channels through soft soil. Grasslands push aggressively into the region as forests thin even more. Some apes retreat to forests. Others stay and adapt. Among those who stay, something begins to change. They spend more time on the ground than any primate before them. They forage for foods increasingly found in open habitats: tubers, seeds, roots, insects, occasional scavenged meat. The shape of their pelvis shifts. Their spines begin to curve differently. Their arms become slightly shorter relative to their legs. Their hands refine precision grips. The complex interplay between environment, diet, and survival reshapes their bodies in tiny increments over millions of years. The Miocene does not give us fossils of these transformations, but it gives us their shadows, the earliest hints that the ape lineage is splitting into something new, something that will, millions of years later, stand upright on savannas, craft tools, paint walls, and ask questions about a world it no longer remembers. The end of the Miocene is not just the end of an epoch, it is the prelude to humanity. A world of shrinking forests, expanding grasslands, and relentless climate swings becomes the testing ground that demands from primates something extraordinary: flexibility, intelligence, innovation, and eventually a step onto two legs. But before that step comes the silence again. The missing fossils, the erased chapters, the geological upheavals that hide the evidence. The Miocene gives us everything and nothing. It gives us the roots of apes, the rise of grasslands, the birth of modern ecosystems, the environmental crucible that shaped our ancestors. But it also withholds the details of how those ancestors crossed the threshold from tree-bound apes to creatures destined for consciousness. This is the paradox of the Miocene. It is both the birthplace of our lineage and one of the most mysterious landscapes in evolutionary history. By the time the Miocene gave way to the Pliocene, the world had already endured tens of millions of years of cooling, drying, shifting, eroding, and rebuilding, an endless cycle of experimentation that forced life into new shapes again and again. But the Pliocene was different. It wasn't simply another chapter. It was the knife's edge, the crucible, the threshold where ancient apes stepped into a world that would sculpt the earliest shadows of humanity. Landscapes changed faster. Climates swung harder. Survival demanded more than instinct. It demanded innovation. It demanded flexibility. And from that pressure emerged the beings who would one day dominate the planet. The Pliocene begins quietly in the geological record, but its effects reverberate through every layer of the Earth's story. Gone are the sprawling forests that once covered continents. Gone are the endless Miocene canopies, the broadleaf jungles, the woodland sanctuaries in which early apes thrived. In their place rise sprawling grasslands, thick savannas, thorny shrublands, and semi-arid plains that stretch toward distant horizons. The world has become a mosaic of open spaces and shrinking refuge. And for primates, creatures that had spent tens of millions of years in trees, the ground is no longer an optional territory. It is a necessity. Picture East Africa at the dawn of the Pliocene. The ground trembles with the pull of tectonic forces, splitting the continent, carving deep valleys where lush vegetation once thrived. Volcanoes spew ash that settles in layered bands across the landscape, layers that will someday preserve glimpses of those who walked here. Lakes appear and disappear unpredictably, fed by seasonal rains that no longer follow reliable patterns. Rivers carve new channels, hills rise, basins collapse. It's a world of shifting fortune, a world that demands that any species hoping to survive must move, adapt, and rethink what life even means. In this environment, primates face a difficult reckoning. They can no longer rely solely on the life strategies of their ancestors. Forest foods become seasonal, water sources migrate, predators shift their hunting grounds, competition intensifies. Those who cling too tightly to the old ways fade away, their fossils, if any, buried beneath layers of ash and sediment that will confuse paleontologists for generations. But some primates take another path. These early hominins, still small-bodied, still not fully human, still connected to their ape heritage, begin exploring the ground with increasing frequency. They walk upright for short distances to reach fruiting shrubs, to carry food, to liberate their hands from locomotion. They stand tall to scan for predators, to view distant water sources, to follow migrating herds of grazing animals. Walking upright is not yet their default mode, but it is becoming a powerful tool. And in evolution, tools become habits, and habits become anatomical transformations. These first explorers of the savanna are not yet human. Their brains remain small, closer to chimpanzees than to the species they will eventually give rise to. Their lives are filled with daily uncertainty. Yet everything about the world around them pushes them toward becoming something new. The savanna is not a place of rest. It is a place of testing, heat, drought, shifting resources, and relentless danger. Imagine a small group of early hominins moving cautiously through tall grass. Their eyes scan the horizon for predators, big cats, saber-toothed carnivores, massive hyenas. Their ears twitch at the distant rumbling of migrating herbivores. They travel not in the safety of trees, but across open ground, their bodies still not fully adapted to upright walking. They sway slightly, their strides short, but they persist because the trees, their ancestral home, no longer provide enough food to support them year-round. The savanna holds opportunity: tubers, seeds, carrion, insects, roots, and occasional fruit. But those opportunities come with risks that demand sharper minds, faster decisions, and social cooperation. These pressures are the unseen architects of what is to come. They shape cognition before they shape bones. They shape strategy before they shape anatomy. They reward those who can remember where water lies after months of drought, where fruiting trees grow in an unpredictable landscape, where predators patrol during dry seasons. The fossil record that documents these early hominins is small, almost insultingly small. Much of Africa's Pliocene sediments were exposed to erosion long before modern science could discover them. Bones were swept away by rains, gnawed by scavengers, dissolved by mineral-rich water, or buried in regions too unstable to preserve them. What remains are precious clues: fragments of femurs showing changes in weight distribution, pelvises reshaping for upright gait, skulls with subtle enlargements in the brain case, and teeth worn by new diets. One such fossil, just a partial skeleton, reveals a pelvis angled differently from that of apes. Another shows a curvature in the spine that supports upright posture. Another sports a knee joint capable of locking in place while standing. These adaptations never appear all at once. Each emerges in increments so small we can barely trace the path between forms. But when we see them together, across fragments found years or continents apart, we begin to understand the transformation happening across the Pliocene. And then there are the tools, not yet the crafted stone tools of later hominins, but the earliest forms of object manipulation. Sticks used to probe termite mounds, stones thrown at small prey or predators, bones used to dig for roots. None of these leave clear archaeological signatures. Wood decays, bones shatter, stone throwing leaves no reliable record. But the behavior itself is a turning point. Using objects as extensions of the body sets the stage for the technological explosion still millions of years in the future. Meanwhile, the world continues reshaping itself. Climate oscillations ripple across continents. In some areas, forests briefly regrow during wetter periods, only to vanish again as drought returns. Hominins move between these environments, becoming masters of flexibility. They travel farther on foot. They learn the patterns of seasonal migration among animals. They begin to understand, not consciously, but instinctively, the ways water, vegetation, and prey interact. These movements are not random. They carve invisible trails across Africa, trails that would one day be traced by archaeologists searching for clues about human origins. But those trails remain mostly invisible in the fossil record. The bones of individuals who walked them are gone, save for rare specimens preserved by extraordinary chance. Yet even with so few fossils, the Pliocene stands as the threshold where humans begin to emerge in silhouette. Their hands become more dexterous, their thumbs more capable of precision grips, their minds more attuned to cooperation, planning, and shared survival. Their bodies adjust to bipedal life, hips widen, lower backs curve, feet reshape with arches capable of absorbing shock. These changes unfold over millions of years, yet most of them happen in periods where fossilization was rare. Imagine a group of early hominins gathering around a carcass left behind by a large predator. They sniff the air for danger, listening for the growl of a saber-toothed cat returning to claim its kill. If the coast is clear, they rush forward, tearing into the flesh with sharp-edged stones or scavenged bones. They eat fast, in a frenzy, because danger lurks in every shadow. These moments, grisly, opportunistic, are among the earliest steps toward dietary shifts that will eventually fuel bigger brains. But the fossil record tells us almost nothing about these behaviors. They are inferred through comparison with modern primates, through the shape of teeth, through wear patterns on bones. The savanna does not preserve daily life. It preserves only what it can. Death, mostly, and only under perfect circumstances. Across the Pliocene, countless hominin species rise and fall. Some become specialized in ways that prove advantageous for a time, but ultimately limit their future. Others remain flexible, generalist, adaptable. It is this flexibility, this ability to survive in forests, woodlands, and savannas, that shapes the lineage that eventually gives rise to the first members of the genus Homo. But that arrival is still far away. For now, the Pliocene is filled with ghost lineages, species that must have existed because their descendants appear later in the record, but whose own bones are missing. They lived, thrived, reproduced, and died without leaving a trace visible to us. Perhaps their bones were trampled by migrating herds. Perhaps they were buried in mud that later eroded. Perhaps they lived in regions where fossilization was nearly impossible. Mountains, sandy plains, riverbanks scoured by seasonal floods. The absence is not evidence of their insignificance. It is evidence of how fragile the fossilization process truly is. Still, from the clues we do have, we know the Pliocene reshaped hominin lives in every dimension. Their bodies grew more suited to distance walking. Their minds became more social. Their diets diversified. Their risks multiplied. Their opportunities expanded. Then, as the Pliocene draws toward its end, another climatic shift begins. A cooling so intense it will usher in the ice ages. The first great glaciations form in the northern hemisphere. Sea levels drop. Weather patterns shift dramatically. Rainfall becomes erratic again. Grasslands spread even further. Forests shrink to narrower bands. Hominins face a world even harsher than before. But instead of disappearing, they adapt once more. Experiments intensify. Some species shift toward heavier chewing muscles, adapting to tougher foods. Others refine their social structures, depending on numbers for survival. A few grow slightly larger brains, still small compared to modern humans, but enough to open the door to more complex thinking. These changes do not guarantee survival. Many hominin species vanish, ghosts of evolution whose stories remain locked in sediments that will never be found. But the ones who persist stand on the edge of transformation. They are about to cross a boundary no primate has crossed before, the boundary into recognizable humanity. But before that leap comes another silence, another blank stretch in the fossil record, another period where bones are lost, sediments are destroyed, landscapes shift, and the clues we need most evaporate into time. The Pliocene ends with promise and mystery in equal measure. The foundation of humanity has been laid, but its shape is still a shadow. The world has nearly finished its preparations. The stage is set, and soon, In the early Pleistocene, the first members of Homo will step forward, walking upright, thinking differently, leaving marks that will finally begin to survive in stone. For now, the Pliocene remains the hinge on which evolution turns, a landscape where apes learned to brave the open, where brains began to grow, where hands learned new possibilities, and where the long road to humanity truly began. The arrival of the Pleistocene was not a gentle shift, but a planetary convulsion. It was the moment when Earth began freezing and thawing in vast, repeating pulses, ice advancing like a slow, relentless tide, then retreating again as if the planet were catching its breath. This epoch, stretching more than 2 million years, was the world's great sculptor. It carved mountains, redirected rivers, reshaped continents, and forced every living thing into a cycle of adaptation that would break the unprepared and reward the resilient. And within this crucible of cold and chaos, the genus Homo emerged. Not instantly human, not yet capable of reshaping the world, but carrying the first sparks of what would become our improbable story. The landscape during early Pleistocene times is a world of extremes. In one region, glaciers hundreds of feet thick grind against rock, turning mountains into dust. In another, grasslands stretch to the horizon, golden and wind-swept. Forests pulse with life during brief, warm interludes, only to wither when temperatures plunge again. Rivers shift courses with each glacial advance. Lakes appear and vanish, leaving behind basins that will one day confuse geologists. Volcanoes erupt across the Rift Valley, laying down layers of ash that will someday preserve footprints, bones, and tools, but only for the briefest geological moments. Into this unstable world steps Homo habilis, or something very much like it. The fossil record refuses to give us a clean lineage. Names and classifications are human conveniences, ways of sorting what is, in reality, a blur of transitional forms. But whatever we call them, these early members of the human family are the first to leave behind something unmistakable. Tools shaped by intention. Simple stone flakes. Sharp edges meant for cutting meat from bone, for slicing through plant fibers, for scraping hides. These tools are crude compared to what will come later, yet they represent a profound shift. For the first time, primates are altering the physical world with purpose. They are not simply using objects opportunistically, they are shaping them to fit imagined needs. The difference between chance and choice is everything, and the Pleistocene amplifies that difference across millions of years. Imagine a small band of these early humans crouched beside a riverbank. The air is cold, carrying the scent of frost from distant mountains. A carcass lies nearby, fresh enough to attract predators, risky enough that hesitation means losing a vital source of calories. The group works quickly, stoneflakes clicking against bone. Children watch closely, learning not through instruction, but through imitation. Knowledge at this stage is not spoken. It is felt, repeated, refined. And each generation inherits just a little more skill than the one before. Yet for all the confidence we place in these tools, the fossil record documenting this transformation is painfully thin. Bones appear scattered across sites, separated by hundreds of thousands of years. Skulls show incremental increases in brain size, just enough to suggest that thinking, planning, memory, and communication were becoming more sophisticated. But the spaces between these fossils feel like caverns. We know tool-making did not appear overnight. but many early attempts likely left no trace. The earliest stone flakes we've found may not be the first made, only the first preserved. This is the story of the Pleistocene, survival unfolding in the shadows between fossils. As glacial cycles intensify, so do selective pressures. Early humans face predators on an unprecedented scale: massive saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, packs of swift, specialized hunters adapted to harsh climates. Survival demands cooperation. Cooperation encourages communication. Communication fosters imagination. These intangible traits, invisible in bone, are the true evolutionary leap of the early Pleistocene. Picture a night on the savannah. A small fire crackles, perhaps not intentionally lit, perhaps sparked by lightning and simply preserved by clever hands. Early humans sit around it, their faces illuminated by flickering orange light. The flames keep predators at bay, but more importantly, they draw the group together. Flames mesmerize, they slow thought. They encourage the emergence of something new, shared attention. And in shared attention lies the seed of storytelling, planning, learning through memory rather than instinct. But again, none of this fossilizes. Fire used casually leaves no trace. Words leave no imprint. Concepts evaporate into air. The early Pleistocene is filled with such invisible revolutions, transformations in mind, society, communication, that we can only infer through hints. Meanwhile, the Earth continues its violent cycles. Ice sheets expand across the northern hemisphere. Sea levels plummet, exposing land bridges between continents. Animals migrate across these temporary highways, and humans follow. Populations split, reunite, and split again. Genetic lineages diverge as groups adapt to different climates: cold grasslands, temperate forests, tropical plains. In East Africa, the Rift Valley remains a crucible. Lakes fill and evaporate repeatedly, trapping organic material beneath volcanic ash that sometimes, only sometimes, fossilizes bones and footprints. It's here that we find some of the most extraordinary evidence of early human life. Footprints pressed into ancient mud, showing gait, stride, weight distribution. These tracks whisper secrets about posture, locomotion, and group movement, but they are snapshots, not chapters. The story between footsteps remains hidden. Then, somewhere between 2 and 1.5 million years ago, a new form emerges, taller, stronger, with a brain nearly twice the size of its predecessors. Homo erectus is a watershed, the first human ancestor to look uncannily like us from the neck down. These beings walk with long strides. They run long distances. They hunt in coordinated groups. Their tools are no longer simple flakes, but carefully shaped hand axes, teardrop-shaped, symmetrical, requiring planning, patience, and skill to produce. A hand axe is not just a tool, it is a statement. It reveals a mind capable of holding an image of the finished product before the first strike of stone against stone. It shows an ability to learn through observation and teaching, not just imitation. And it hints at something even more remarkable: shared culture. Picture a group of Homo erectus individuals sitting on a flat patch of earth, shaping stones together. One strikes, the others watch. The rhythm of flake production becomes a kind of language, not spoken, but transmitted socially. Over generations, this knowledge becomes tradition. Traditions become identity. Identity becomes culture. And culture becomes the glue that holds groups together through the harshest Pleistocene winters. Yet for all their achievements, the fossil record of Homo erectus feels incomplete. Their bones appear across Africa, Asia, and Europe, but the gaps between discoveries are immense. We know they spread far and wide, but the routes they took remain speculative. We know they hunted, foraged, migrated, but the details dissolve into sediment. Their campsites, shelters, and rituals vanish without leaving clear evidence. Still, Homo erectus leaves behind something different from earlier hominins, something that persists through time: longevity. This species survives nearly 2 million years, adapting repeatedly to climate swings that toppled countless lineages. Their endurance is not an accident. It is the product of flexibility, cooperation, tool-making, and social learning. It is the first sign that the human approach to survival is not brute force, but ingenuity. As the Pleistocene continues, climate pulses intensify. Glaciers advance, then retreat. Oceans rise and fall by hundreds of feet. Ecosystems scramble. Species migrate, evolve, or go extinct. And amidst this chaos, new human forms emerge from the shadows left by earlier transitions. Somewhere between 1 million and 500,000 years ago, a lineage begins to diverge. Their brains enlarge. Their bodies adapt to colder climates. They develop control of fire, not just opportunistic use, but mastery. They cook food, making calories more accessible. They warm themselves, allowing migrations into regions early humans never could have endured. They craft clothing from hides. They build more permanent shelters. From these innovations emerge the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Imagine a cold steppe under a pale winter sun. A small group huddles inside a shelter lined with animal skins, a fire burning steadily in the center. Outside, winds howl across frozen plains. Inside, warmth radiates from glowing embers. A young child stares into the flame, watching sparks drift upward. Their elders speak in soft tones, not yet modern language, but structured enough to be meaningful. This world, harsh but survivable, shapes minds capable of planning far into the future. But again, fossils tell only fragments. A skull showing increased cranial capacity, tools more refined than before. Charcoal layers hinting at controlled fire, bones with cut marks suggesting organized hunting. But the songs, the emotions, the social bonds, those vanish completely, the most important parts of human evolution lost to the mercy of time. Meanwhile, in Africa, another lineage continues evolving. Their faces become flatter, their teeth smaller, their bodies more efficient at long-distance travel, their tools more sophisticated. They begin using pigments. Perhaps they decorate their bodies. Perhaps they mark territory. Perhaps they create symbols. These early behavioral shifts, though invisible in direct evidence, lay the groundwork for symbolic thought. A thought, once imagined, becomes a tool more powerful than any stone. Yet the fossil record remains frustratingly silent. Whole populations lived and died without leaving bones durable enough to survive erosion, scavenging, or geological upheaval. The story of early Homo sapiens is written in tiny fragments of skulls, in stone tools left scattered across landscapes, in DNA preserved in the teeth of a few individuals. And even that story is riddled with gaps. By the Middle Pleistocene, the human family is no longer a single lineage, but a web of interrelated species: Neanderthals, Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, and other ghost populations whose genetic echoes survive, but whose fossils are missing. They meet, they exchange knowledge, they interbreed. They influence each other's trajectories. But most of what they shared disappears into the same silence that swallowed the earliest hominins. What survives is the result of extraordinary chance. A tooth fossilized in sediment, protected from erosion for hundreds of thousands of years, a skull trapped beneath volcanic ash, a fragment of bone preserved in a cave cold enough to prevent decay. These fragments are precious, but they remind us of how much we will never know. The Pleistocene ends with Homo sapiens stepping fully into the light, carrying fire, tools, symbols, memory, and imagination. But that final emergence, that moment when we become unmistakably human, is built on layers of missing chapters. 1,000,000 years of innovation happened in places where fossils could not form, where evidence washed away, where memories dissolved into dust. The Pleistocene is not just the Ice Age. It is the era in which humanity's mind was forged, in cold nights under open skies, in shared fires that warmed frozen hands, in migrations across landscapes reshaped by glaciers, in cooperation that ensured survival when everything else failed. And even now, we stand on its shoulders, built from its silences, carrying the echoes of a world we will never fully recover. By the time the late Pleistocene tightened its icy grip around the world, humanity was no longer a quiet experiment in some forgotten corner of Africa. It was becoming a force, shaped by cold, sharpened by hunger, strengthened by cooperation, and driven by something no other creature possessed in equal measure: imagination. The world around our ancestors was unforgiving, beautiful, enormous, and deadly. Glaciers advanced across continents like silent armies, carving valleys and grinding mountains into powder. Mammoths roamed wind-swept plains. Giant predators stalked the shadowed edges of twilight. And scattered across this world were small, determined bands of humans, fragile in body, yet astonishingly resilient in mind. They were not yet the global presence they would become, but their footprints were spreading. From the grasslands of East Africa to the cold steppes of Eurasia, from the Levantine corridors to the ancient woodlands of Europe, early Homo sapiens walked paths shaped long before by other human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and mysterious groups whose names remain unknown. But Homo sapiens carried something deep within them that would eventually change the fate of every landscape they touched. They carried the ability to envision futures not yet real. Picture a small human group traveling across a frozen plain during a glacial peak. The wind screams across open ground, carrying particles of ice that cut against exposed skin. The sky is a washed-out blue, muted by cold. Their fur-wrapped bodies huddle close together, forming a moving shape against the endless white. In their hands, they grip long spears hardened by fire. Slung over their backs are pouches filled with stone blades, carved bone points, and animal sinew. Every item they carry has been shaped intentionally, refined over countless generations of trial and error, memory and instruction. These people do not walk blindly across this frozen world. They navigate by landmarks, rock outcrops, tree clusters, riverbeds buried beneath snow. They possess mental maps constructed not from instinct, but from teaching, storytelling, and shared experience. One person remembers a valley rich with game during a warmer season. Another recalls a sheltered cave the group used decades earlier. A third knows the shape of the stars that guide travel across open steppe. This is the quiet brilliance of early humanity. Their survival is built on memory and foresight, woven together into a collective intelligence. But even as they spread, the fossil record betrays them. Their bones rarely survive the erosions of time. Their shelters, tents of hide and bone, ephemeral huts of branches, vanish without leaving permanent traces. Their migration routes lie buried beneath rising seas or eroded plains. Caves preserve some of their passing, but only those lucky enough to escape collapse or flooding. Most of the evidence, clothing, baskets, wooden tools, early art, was swallowed by the earth long before archaeologists could find it. And so much of the late Pleistocene story remains a ghost, felt, inferred, hinted at, but never fully seen. Even this era, so close to us in geological terms, hides more than it reveals. Somewhere in Africa, humans refine their tools again. Blades become thinner, sharper, crafted with precision that speaks of growing dexterity and mental planning. Hunting strategies evolve. Instead of merely tracking prey, they coordinate complex group hunts. They learn to observe seasonal migrations. They recognize patterns in animal behavior. They understand wind direction, scent, camouflage. They combine instinct with strategy, and the result is a level of adaptability unmatched by any creature of the time. A family sits around a fire, children leaning close to the warmth, while elders carve tools from bone. Sparks drift upward, disappearing into the cold night air. Overhead, stars glimmer with a clarity only possible in a world free from smoke and electric light. Someone begins to speak, not in the gestures or simple sounds of earlier hominins, but in language with structure, depth, nuance. They tell a story about where to find herds when the snows come. They warn of a predator that hunts near the river crossing. They describe the distant fire of volcanoes seen during a journey years earlier. In these words lie the seeds of culture, memory preserved through sound, not fossil. This is where humanity begins to diverge from every other branch of the hominin family. While other human species adapt physically to their environments, Homo sapiens adapt mentally and socially. Tools become more refined, clothing becomes more effective, fire becomes a partner, not a curiosity. Art begins to appear, carvings, pigments, shapes drawn on cave walls that serve purposes both practical and mystical, but the record remains fragmented. For every cave painting discovered, there are likely thousands lost to the slow grinding of time. For every carved bone preserved, countless others decayed in soil too acidic to forgive their delicacy. The fossil record does not lie. It simply fails to capture the full complexity of this transformative age. What it does show, though, is that humans were not alone. Neanderthals roamed Europe and parts of Asia with incredible resilience. Their bodies were powerful, their minds advanced, their toolkits impressive. They hunted massive game with coordination and skill. They cared for their injured. They crafted symbolic objects. They understood the land deeply. And in many places, Homo sapiens encountered them, not as enemies at first, but as neighbors, traders, companions, and, as genetic evidence now reveals, partners in survival. Humanity is not a single thread. It is a braid woven from many strands. On cold nights in European caves, Neanderthal families huddled near fires, tending to their children with tenderness that defies the stereotypes once laid upon them. In the mountains of Siberia, Denisovans thrived in altitudes that would exhaust modern humans. In Southeast Asia, other human groups, tiny-bodied, tool-using hominins, navigated dense forests with quiet mastery. Each lineage told a story of survival shaped by environment, instinct, and innovation. But eventually, one by one, these lineages began to vanish. Climate change played its part. As glaciers advanced and retreated, environments shifted rapidly. Forests grew and shrank. Herds migrated unpredictably. Rivers dried. Food sources changed. Human bodies evolved, but Homo sapiens possessed the extra advantage, adaptability not limited by biology. They crafted new tools, invented new hunting techniques, formed larger and more complex social networks, and passed knowledge across generations with increasing sophistication. The other species adapted too, but the Pleistocene was ruthless. A slight delay in innovation could mean extinction. A failed migration could doom a lineage. A shift in prey population could collapse a society. And then there was interbreeding. Genetic exchanges between groups gave some populations advantages: immunity, cold resistance, high-altitude adaptation. But in the long run, as environments changed yet again, Homo sapiens emerged as the most flexible. Still, the disappearance of the other species remains shrouded in mystery. Fossils become sparse near the end of their timelines. Neanderthal populations shrink, their archaeological sites becoming fewer. Denisovans vanish into genetic echoes. Other human groups disappear so thoroughly that entire species are known from a single finger bone or tooth. A continent-wide silence emerges, as if the earth itself turned a page. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens begin doing something no other species had ever done: altering landscapes on purpose. They burn grasslands to flush game. They gather plants that eventually become domesticated. They craft shelters durable enough to survive in extreme climates. They develop clothing tailored for function and protection. They shape rivers with stones. They store food. They carry fire across distances. They cross deserts, mountains, and oceans. All of this unfolds long before the first city, long before the first written word. Yet almost none of it fossilizes. Archaeological sites show glimpses, but the full scope of human innovation during the late Pleistocene remains an ocean with only a few islands visible above the waves of time. Picture a group of early humans arriving on a coastline after weeks of travel. They stand on a cliff overlooking a vast sea, waves crashing against rocks below. They do not understand the ocean's enormity, but they sense opportunity. Shellfish, tidal pools, driftwood, new hunting grounds. They settle temporarily, building shelters from branches and hides. Over time, these coastal foragers develop diets rich in fish and marine resources, fueling brain growth and increasing their cognitive flexibility. But the tides erase their camps. Storms scatter their shelters. Winds wipe clean their paths. What remains for us are tiny shells. Scattered becomes nothing more than hints embedded in sand, now turned to stone. And yet, these coastal foragers are part of the story that leads to the global expansion of humanity. As the Pleistocene approaches its end, humans begin spreading beyond the Old World. Land bridges exposed by low sea levels invite migrations into regions untouched by any human species before. Into Australia, into the Americas, into remote islands. Each migration is fraught with danger: storms, predators, unfamiliar plants, barren landscapes. But again, imagination guides them. They see possibility where others saw only obstacles, and in doing so, they begin the transformation from a species shaped by the world to a species shaping the world itself. The late Pleistocene ends with a warming pulse, rapid, dramatic, world-changing. Glaciers melt, seas rise, forests reclaim territory, animals migrate in new directions, entire megafauna species vanish, leaving behind bones that spark modern debates. The planet's instability reaches a climax that forces humanity into its next great leap. Settlement, agriculture, civilization. But that next chapter belongs to another time. For now, the end of the Pleistocene stands as a monumental threshold. It is the moment when the last of the ancient human species fade away, when Homo sapiens alone walks the earth, carrying the memories, lessons, and genetic echoes of those who came before. This was not destiny. It was survival. Earned day by day, shaped by ice and fire, guided by imagination and adaptation, preserved not in fossils, but in the silent architecture of our bones and minds. The world was ready for humans. But more importantly, humans were finally ready for the world. When the great ice sheets of the late Pleistocene began their final retreat, the world did not simply warm. It awakened. Rivers tore open new paths through the land. Seas rose with unforgiving force, swallowing coastlines where generations of humans had once hunted, gathered, and passed down knowledge beside the waves. Forests spread into territories that had been frozen wastelands for tens of thousands of years. Grasslands shifted, deserts breathed, mountains shed their icy armor. The earth was rewriting itself with a speed that felt almost violent, and humanity, now the only surviving human species, was swept into a cascade of transformations that would redefine everything about how they lived. The Holocene had begun, though the people of that time had no word for epochs. What they had were instincts, traditions, memories, and imaginations sharpened by tens of thousands of years of survival under harsh and unpredictable skies. They stood on the threshold of a world where stability, true stability, was finally possible. But stability came with a question that no human had ever faced at such scale. How do we live when nature no longer pushes us from place to place? What happens when the land stops shifting under our feet long enough for us to shape it in return? Picture the earliest moments of this new world. The air is warmer, carrying scents of blooming plants that had been dormant for centuries. Herds of grazing animals surge northward along fresh migratory corridors carved by melting glaciers. The great mammoths that once thundered across frozen plains grow scarce, their rhythms disrupted by climatic upheaval and human hunters more coordinated than ever before. The giant predators, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, enormous hyenas, begin their slow retreat into extinction, shadows of their former dominance. Landscapes that once belonged to the megafauna now await new rulers, though no creature yet realizes that the next transformation will not come from nature, but from the minds of the humans who inhabit it. In fertile valleys, small groups begin experimenting with something quietly revolutionary, staying. Not fully settled, not fully nomadic, something in between. The seasonal movements that once spanned hundreds of miles shrink to smaller circuits centered around regions where plants grow more reliably, where rivers swell predictably, where game gathers in abundance. As climate stability increases, so does the reliability of resources. Human families remain close to the same riverbanks year after year. The idea of place becomes more than a memory. It becomes a foundation. Archaeological sites from this era, rare, fragile, and often erased by later civilizations, offer snapshots of these beginnings. Hearths clustered together, post holes indicating shelters rebuilt across generations, grinding stones worn smooth by constant use, tools crafted not for long migrations, but for tasks rooted in the same landscape. Human burials appear more frequently, often marked by objects of significance: shell beads, ochre, carved figurines. These burials hint at something deeper: the emergence of identity tied to a location, a lineage, a shared story. And yet, for all its significance, the archaeological record remains incomplete. Floods bury sites under layers of silt. Rising seas swallow entire coastlines where early humans likely built some of their first semi-permanent camps. The earliest experiences of long-term settlement, the rituals that developed, the first attempts at organizing community, most of this is lost. What we have are glimpses, as though looking through a cracked window at a world taking its first steps toward complexity. As forests expand across Eurasia and North America, humans follow game into these new woodlands. They adapt tools for cutting, carving, shaping, and hunting within dense vegetation. Stone blades grow more specialized, bone needles appear. Clothing becomes more refined, stitched, tailored, decorated. People express themselves not just for function, but for meaning. Patterns on clothing, designs etched onto tools, body paint, jewelry, the symbolic world grows richer, though few of these expressions survive the ravages of time. But one development stands above the others in its significance. Humans begin manipulating plants, not agriculture in the way it will later be understood, but the earliest hints of domestication. Observations accumulate. Certain seeds grow better when scattered near camps. Some plants sprout more consistently in disturbed soil. Tubers flourish when old vegetation is cleared. Humans, knowingly or unknowingly, begin curating the ecosystems around them. They burn patches of land to encourage the growth of edible plants. They select seeds from the most productive stalks. They protect certain shrubs from grazing animals. These shifts represent the beginning of a profound relationship between humans and the natural world, a relationship that will eventually transform both. As plant management improves, so does food security. More stable food sources lead to larger gatherings. Larger gatherings lead to bigger social networks. Communication, storytelling, cooperation, rituals, these grow in complexity alongside population density. The human mind, already shaped by tens of thousands of years of symbolic thought, now finds new outlets. Art flourishes. Carvings become more detailed. Cave paintings become more narrative. Music emerges through rhythm and breath. The impulse to express meaning through form becomes universal. Imagine a group gathered at dusk beside a river at the end of a successful season. A storyteller stands near a fire, gesturing towards the horizon as children lean in, adults listen, and the crackle of flames mingles with the murmur of the water. They recount hunts, migrations, conflicts, storms, births. They recount events from generations earlier, preserved like treasures in memory. They tell these stories not simply to entertain, but to teach, where the best hunting grounds lie, when the rains return, how to survive drought, how to read the land. Before writing, before cities, before agriculture, storytelling is the first structure of civilization. But even as humans begin to experiment with staying, the world around them continues its own transformations. The melting of the great ice sheets releases staggering amounts of fresh water into the oceans. Sea levels rise globally. Coastlines redraw themselves year after year. Valleys that once supported thriving human settlements vanish beneath waves. Evidence of entire cultures disappears without trace. The oldest human villages may lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, unreachable and unrecognizable. As the Holocene progresses, something extraordinary happens. Humans learn to shape landscapes intentionally. They clear forests using fire. They build fences from brushwood to guide animals. They dig storage pits. They construct simple irrigation systems that channel water from streams. These innovations are not yet the organized agriculture of later millennia, but they represent a profound shift. Humans are no longer passive participants in the environment. They are active stewards. The archaeological record, for all its gaps, shows a slow but unmistakable trend. The rhythm of human life shifts from the unpredictability of nomadism toward the stability of settlement. And then, in several parts of the world, each independent of the others, the great leap occurs. Agriculture. Not overnight, not suddenly, but as a culmination of countless generations observing, experimenting, failing, adjusting, and trying again. Seeds are saved. Fields are cleared, plants are tended deliberately. The first crops, wild ancestors of wheat, barley, millet, rice, maize, bend human societies toward permanence. Food surpluses grow, storerooms appear, vessels are crafted for transport and preservation. People begin staying long enough to bury their dead in the same place for generations. With surplus comes specialization. Not everyone must hunt or gather. Some become tool makers, some become artisans, some become coordinators of communal resources. Slowly, the seeds of hierarchy take root. For the first time in human history, communities become more than small family groups. Villages emerge, clusters of shelters arranged around shared spaces. Paths form between dwellings. Ritual structures appear. Social rules evolve. Disputes require mediation. Alliances require negotiation. The concept of property, once fluid, becomes anchored to land and harvest. These changes usher humanity toward structures it will later recognize as governance, culture, and civilization. Yet for all the significance of this shift, the fossil and archaeological record remains staggeringly incomplete. For every early farming settlement discovered, hundreds have been lost to erosion, flooding, later construction, or the simple passage of time. The earliest experiments with farming, those fragile first generations of cultivated grain, likely occurred in places where the soil chemistry destroys organic remains. We know agriculture arose independently in multiple regions, but the details of how each culture first crossed that threshold are largely invisible. Still, the consequences echo across time. Once humans learn to manipulate plants, they soon learn to manipulate animals. The first domestications appear, dogs earlier in the Pleistocene, then goats, sheep, cattle, pigs. This transition reshapes human diets, economies, migrations, and identities. Domesticated animals become companions, workers, symbols, and sources of stability in a world still capable of unpredictable change. As populations grow, myths grow with them. Communities craft creation stories, ancestor tales, explanations for the forces of nature. Rituals arise around harvest cycles, animal migrations, solstices, and celestial patterns. Humans begin observing the sky with curiosity that will eventually become astronomy. They carve symbols into stone. They erect markers aligned with sun and moon. They develop early calendars, counting seasons and predicting rains. These first mythologies, and the rituals built around them, are the earliest architectures of meaning. They appear in figurines, in burial goods, in pigments used on bodies and cave walls. Most of these artifacts crumble long before modern eyes can see them. But the surviving pieces suggest a world in which humans were beginning to ask questions larger than survival. Who are we? Why are we here? What forces shape the world? Before temples, before cities, before empires, there were questions. And then, somewhere within the early Holocene, the first permanent settlements take shape with clear boundaries, organized spaces, crafted structures. They are not yet cities, but they are more than villages. They contain storage granaries, communal buildings, workshops, hearths arranged for shared living. Trade begins. People carry obsidian across hundreds of miles, exchanging goods, ideas, and rituals. Knowledge accelerates: how to build stronger shelters, how to shape finer blades, how to cultivate richer soils. The world is changing, and humanity is changing with it, not through brute adaptation, but through intention. The Holocene becomes the age of mastery. But mastery does not come suddenly. It is built on the shoulders of ancestors who experimented in fields now erased by floods. It grows from forgotten rituals performed beside forgotten rivers. It carries the genetic legacy of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others whose names we will never know. It is shaped by tens of thousands of years of migration, loss, survival, and imagination under the harsh cycles of the Pleistocene. And even as the Holocene dawns with an unprecedented promise of stability, the archaeological record still hides far more than it reveals. The first farms, first shrines, first attempts at pottery, first social hierarchies. So many of these remain buried in soil, not yet uncovered or dissolved in regions where time is merciless. Yet one thing becomes unmistakably clear: the world is no longer shaping humans alone. Humans are beginning to shape the world. By the time early villages transformed into the first true settlements, humanity had already crossed an invisible threshold. The Holocene, this brief geological heartbeat of warmth and stability, had become the stage on which humans no longer simply reacted to the world. They had begun reshaping it. Forests were cleared intentionally, fields were carved into hillsides, rivers were diverted. Animals were bred for traits that suited human needs. Plants were coaxed into forms they had never taken before. And in this growing mastery over land, water, and life itself, the foundations of civilization began to rise, not in a single place or a single moment, but in dozens of regions across the world, each building toward complexity in ways both similar and profoundly unique. Imagine one of these early settlements, perhaps in the Fertile Crescent, though it could just as easily be in the Yangtze Valley, Central America, the Niger River Basin, or the Indus floodplains. The dawn light spills across clusters of mud brick homes, their walls smooth from repeated repairs. Smoke wafts gently from hearths as families begin their morning tasks. Children chase goats through narrow alleyways. Women grind grain on stones that have been worn down through generations of hands. Men carry baskets of crops harvested only days earlier. The smell of earth, fire, grain, and livestock fills the air with a density that speaks of permanence. This scene represents more than a snapshot of daily life. It represents a seismic shift in human identity. For the first time in history, people are tied to land, not by accident, not by temporary need, but by choice and by structure. Farming demands routine. Animals demand routine. Storage demands routine. And routine creates cycles: annual, seasonal, communal. From those cycles emerge traditions, rituals, and increasingly complex forms of organization. But this transformation did not occur in a straight line. The fossil and archaeological record, thin though it may be, reveals a world of experimentation. Early settlements expand, collapse, relocate, reform. Some flourish for centuries before being abandoned. Others vanish in a single generation due to drought, conflict, resource depletion, or disease. Human societies are learning through trial and error how to coexist with the land they are beginning to control. Consider the challenge of early agriculture. Fields must be cleared, planted, tended, harvested, and protected. Seeds must be saved. Tools must be crafted and maintained. Water must be managed. More mouths must be fed, and failures can bring famine. Farming is not a guarantee of security. It is a gamble, one that can strengthen or collapse entire communities. Yet for all its challenges, agriculture unlocks a powerful force: surplus. And surplus unlocks specialization. Once food production exceeds immediate need, individuals can focus on tasks other than obtaining daily calories. Toolmakers refine their craft. Artisans experiment with pottery, weaving, carving. Some individuals become spiritual leaders, guiding rituals tied to seasons, harvest cycles, or the mysteries of life and death. Others emerge as coordinators, figures who mediate disputes, organize labor, or oversee communal storage. These roles are not yet the rigid hierarchies of later civilizations, but they represent the first steps toward structured society. Still, most of these early developments leave little trace. A pot shatters, a wooden structure rots, a textile decomposes. A spoken story vanishes when its last teller dies. Even burial practices, which should offer valuable insights, often occur in soils that destroy bone or in regions later disrupted by natural forces or urban expansion. The earliest forms of leadership, ritual, cooperation, and conflict remain largely speculative, hinted at only through artifacts that surface against staggering odds. But every discovery, no matter how small, points to a world growing more interconnected. Trade networks begin to stretch across vast distances. People carry obsidian, shells, pigments, herbs, and crafted objects for hundreds of miles. Ideas travel with these goods: farming techniques, rituals, myths, stories of distant lands. The world begins to feel both larger and smaller. Communities learn from neighbors. Innovations spread. The pace of collective learning accelerates. Some settlements grow into centers of ritual activity. Evidence of early shrines appears: carved stones, arranged pillars, communal structures that served purposes beyond shelter or storage. These sites suggest that humans were gathering for reasons beyond survival. They were forming identities grounded in shared belief, shared ancestry, shared purpose. Imagine standing before one of these early ritual structures at dawn. Not a temple as later civilizations would build, but a space carved from stone and intention. People gather in silence. They watch the sunrise align with markers positioned deliberately, suggesting an early understanding of celestial patterns. Children learn that the turning of seasons is not random, but part of a great rhythm. Elders speak of ancestors who guide the rains, the harvests, the migrations of animals. These rituals bind the community together, creating a sense of continuity that stretches beyond memory. Yet ritual alone does not define the birth of civilization. Complexity emerges when people learn to predict, calculate, store, plan, and cooperate at scales larger than families or clans. One of the earliest drivers of this complexity is water. In river valleys across the world, Nile, Indus, Tigris, and Euphrates, Yellow River, Mississippi, humans begin manipulating the flow of rivers. They build canals, they construct embankments, they dig wells, they guide seasonal floods onto fields. Water becomes a resource that must be managed collectively. Cooperation becomes not just desirable, but necessary. A poorly timed irrigation decision can ruin an entire harvest. A broken canal can devastate multiple families. These pressures create early administrative systems, rules about who controls water, who maintains canals, who distributes resources. But as society grows, so does inequality. Some individuals accumulate more grain, more livestock, more land. Some gain influence through ritual knowledge. Others gain power through force or persuasion. Hierarchy begins to take shape, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Yet even this process leaves only a faint footprint in the archaeological record. Status items, beads, ornaments, rare stones, sometimes appear in burials, but most social structures remain invisible. Wooden structures, simple workshops, administrative areas, all vanish long before modern discovery. Even warfare, which surely occurred as populations grew and land became scarce, leaves little evidence. Spears rot. Shields decay. Early conflicts leave no written record. We see hints, burned layers in settlements, skeletons with trauma, abandoned villages. But the story of early human conflict is one of the great silences of prehistory. Still, amid all the uncertainty, one trend is undeniable. The human world is growing more organized, more connected, more ambitious. Population increases. Settlements expand. Trade routes stretch across mountains, deserts, and coastlines. Ideas about leadership, ritual, resource management, and identity grow more sophisticated. And then, in multiple regions, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, something extraordinary happens. Writing begins. Not suddenly, not fully formed. Writing evolves slowly from earlier symbolic systems, marks on pottery, tallies carved into bone, tokens representing goods. But once humans learn to record ideas outside the mind, memory changes forever. Writing allows stories to outlive storytellers. It preserves agreements, rituals, genealogies, trade records. It allows knowledge to accumulate rather than reset with each generation. It transforms human society from oral cultures vulnerable to forgetting into civilizations capable of self-reflection and long-term planning. Yet writing does more than preserve information. It amplifies complexity. Bureaucracies form, laws emerge, histories are crafted, myths become codified, leaders assert authority through inscriptions, land is claimed in written records, trade expands exponentially, cities rise as hubs of administration, ritual, and economic exchange. At the same time, writing deepens inequality. Knowledge becomes power. Those who read and write gain influence over those who cannot. Scripts become tools of both enlightenment and control. But the earliest forms of writing, those fragile prototypes, rarely survive. Many were scratched onto perishable materials, wood, leaves, hides that decayed long before archaeologists could recover them. The origin stories of writing, the first phrases ever etched into the world, are lost. Still, what remains marks a turning point unlike any other in human history. Now imagine a city in its early stages. Walls rise from sun-baked earth. Marketplaces hum with voices. Craftsmen work metal, clay, stone. Farmers carry baskets of grain to storage facilities overseen by designated officials. Ritual centers house priests who interpret the will of gods or ancestors. Children learn trades from their elders. Elders debate strategies for dealing with drought, trade, or conflict with neighboring settlements. This city, whether in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, or elsewhere, represents a culmination of tens of thousands of years of experimentation. Sedentism, agriculture, animal domestication, water management, trade, ritual, and writing coalesce into something unprecedented. Society, not simply groups of people living together, but structured, organized, intentionally designed communities with rules, identities, and ambitions. Yet even here, silence overshadows knowledge. Most early cities have vanished beneath later construction, erosion, flooding, or shifting river systems. The earliest monumental structures, roads, workshops, and homes lie buried under layers of time. The people who built them left behind countless traces of their lives, pottery shards, broken tools, bones, but their emotions, motivations, fears, hopes, and conflicts remain unrecorded. As complexity increases, so does vulnerability. Large populations require steady resources. Drought, disease, or conflict can collapse entire civilizations, and many do collapse. Some vanish so thoroughly that only faint traces remain, mounds in the earth, scattered stones, enigmatic artifacts out of context. The Holocene is not a story of continuous progress. It is a story of cycles: growth, complexity, collapse, renewal. Societies rise and fall. Innovations spread and disappear. Myths evolve with each generation. Landscapes shape lives, and humans reshape landscapes in return. But one thread binds all of this together. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species is not merely adapting to environmental change, it is driving it. Humans burn forests to clear land. They dam rivers. They redirect ecosystems. They domesticate plants and animals so completely that new species emerge entirely dependent on humans for survival. And with each transformation, humanity steps further away from the world that shaped it during the Ice Ages. This is the threshold before history, the moment before writing becomes widespread enough to anchor narratives, the point just before myth becomes chronicle. The place where the archaeological record remains too incomplete to answer every question, yet rich enough to reveal a world on the cusp of civilization. The humans of this era do not yet know the future they are building. They do not know that cities will rise and fall, that empires will stretch across continents, that religions will echo across millennia, that technologies will reshape the sky itself. They live in the present, yet their present is creating the framework of everything that will follow. This is the great paradox of the late Holocene. Humanity becomes powerful enough to shape the world, yet the record of that transformation remains fragmentary, eroded, and incomplete. The story is there, written not only in surviving artifacts, but in the land, in the rivers, in the domesticated seeds, in the bones of animals, in the migrations of people whose footprints are long erased by rain. Civilization is beginning. The world is watching. And the final step, one that will take humanity from settlements to cities to societies capable of memory, myth, and monumental creation, is only moments away in the grand timeline of Earth. The age of humanity has begun, but its earliest chapters remain shrouded in time's long silence. By the time humanity stood on the threshold of recorded history, the world had already been transformed beyond recognition. What began as scattered settlements clinging to riversides and fertile valleys had grown into networks of villages, towns, and emerging cities, each connected by trade, conflict, belief, and the shared human drive to shape meaning from the landscape. The earliest sparks of civilization had caught fire, and that fire, nurtured through cooperation, sharpened by necessity, fueled by imagination, would ignite a revolution unlike anything the planet had ever seen. Yet the archaeological and geological record that survives from this final prehistorical chapter remains patchy, erratic, heartbreakingly incomplete. Civilizations rose, flourished, and fell long before their stories could be written in stone. Still, through fragments of ruins, remnants of pottery, worn foundations buried beneath millennia of soil, and the earliest forms of writing carved into clay and bone, we glimpse the birth of the world we now inhabit. This is the moment when humanity stepped fully out of the long evolutionary shadow and began constructing systems that would endure. Picture a young city in Mesopotamia, around 7,000 years ago. The sun rises over mud brick walls, casting long shadows across narrow streets. Smoke curls from hearths where families bake flatbread. Herds of goats and sheep are led through city gates to graze in the surrounding plains. Potters sit at wheels turning slowly under steady hands. Traders unfurl bundles of goods, obsidian, shells, dried fish, fabric, herbs, each item representing a journey across miles and cultures. This city is not yet an empire. It is fragile, complex, and ambitious. Farmers must irrigate their fields with precision to avoid flooding or drought. Storage facilities must be protected. Markets must be regulated. Conflicts must be mediated. These challenges give rise to the earliest administrators, not kings in splendor, but practical organizers who count grain, distribute water, and oversee communal works. These individuals wield soft power, earned through trust or necessity, and they lay the foundations for hierarchical society. Across the world, similar processes unfold independently. In the Nile Valley, communities cluster along the river's predictable flood cycle. In the Indus region, settlements grow according to carefully planned designs, suggesting cooperation on enormous scales. In the Yellow River Basin, early dynastic cultures begin forming mythic histories. In the highlands of Peru and the valleys of Mesoamerica, societies use monumental architecture to anchor ritual and identity. Humanity, once constrained by the limits of mobility and scarcity, becomes a force capable of reshaping entire ecosystems. And yet, the archaeological record of these early civilizations hides almost as much as it reveals. Structures built of wood decay entirely. Documents written on perishable materials rot long before modern discovery. Floods erase entire communities. Shifting rivers bury cities. Growing civilizations often build atop older ones, compressing their stories into geological layers that later require patient, meticulous excavation. What remains are only the physical echoes of complex worlds. Walls, pottery shards, bones, tools, rare inscriptions, and enigmatic ruins whose meanings have been lost. Still, these fragments are enough to trace the arc of transformation. The first monumental structures appear: platforms, temples, storage complexes, constructed not by a single family, but by coordinated labor. The existence of these structures implies something profound: shared belief. People do not build monuments without purpose. Behind every stone lies an idea. Whether that idea is spiritual, political, ancestral, or practical, it marks the birth of organized ideology. Imagine standing at the base of one of these early ceremonial structures. The sun heats the stone beneath your feet. The air fills with voices chanting in rhythms that carry belief across generations. Community members approach with offerings, grains, bones, pigments, crafted items, each representing gratitude or supplication. Elders or ritual specialists move with practiced precision, interpreting celestial alignments, performing seasonal rites, invoking myths that bind the group together. These moments are not isolated. They reflect a growing human obsession with pattern, meaning, memory, and control. Through ritual, humans articulate their relationship with the natural world: rain, sun, flood, drought, harvest. Through ritual, they articulate their relationship with ancestors. Through ritual, they articulate their understanding of life, death, and the vast unknown. These rituals will eventually evolve into religion, law, philosophy, and art. But even as rituals deepen, practical innovations accelerate. Agriculture becomes more sophisticated. Irrigation channels grow more elaborate. Crop rotation appears. Domesticated animals are bred more precisely. Tools improve. Weaving becomes an art. Pottery becomes standardized. Metallurgy emerges. First copper, then bronze. The world does not yet glitter with empires, but it hums with invention. Trade routes expand into continents spanning arteries of exchange. Along these routes flow not only goods but ideas, farming techniques, boat designs, weave-in patterns, myths, musical forms, healing practices. Knowledge spreads faster than ever before, and societies grow more interconnected. But with scale comes tension. Conflicts arise over resources, trade rights, land, and identity. Some settlements fall to neighboring groups. Others fragment under internal pressure. This is not the idyllic dawn of civilization. It is its turbulent birth. Yet even collapses carry seeds of innovation. When a settlement fails, its survivors carry knowledge elsewhere. They adapt it, refine it, merge it with new influences. The repeated cycles of growth and collapse sculpt the world more profoundly than any single golden age. In many regions, writing evolves from simple accounting into storytelling, ritual documentation, and eventually literature. Epic tales, genealogies, laws, and trade agreements become etched into clay tablets, incised on stone, inked onto papyrus. These written records represent humanity's first attempt to defy the silent erasure of time. Before writing, memory was fragile. With writing, memory becomes architecture. But writing, too, unfolds unevenly. Entire civilizations develop complex thought systems without leaving written languages behind. Their stories are locked in the layout of their cities, in their tools, in their artworks. We infer their beliefs from pottery motifs, burial patterns, monumental alignments. But the hearts of their stories, their myths, emotions, philosophies, escape us. The earliest cities become melting pots of innovation and conflict. They give rise to structured leadership, chiefs, councils, priesthoods, and eventually kings. These leaders oversee projects too large for any single family: irrigation systems, defensive walls, ceremonial complexes, regional trade, resource storage. Leadership brings order, but also inequality. Wealth accumulates, social classes emerge. Some individuals gain extraordinary influence. Others struggle within systems that control land, labor, and production. These dynamics mark the birth of politics long before politics gains a name. Imagine a council meeting in one of these early urban centers. Farmers debate water allocations. Traders negotiate caravan protections. Ritual specialists argue for more resources to perform seasonal rites. The discussions grow heated. Decisions shape hundreds of lives. This is the foam at the crest of civilization's wave. Messy, necessary, foundational. But beneath the structure, humanity remains deeply vulnerable. Floods destroy entire settlements. Earthquakes reduce cities to rubble. Droughts precipitate famine. Epidemics sweep through dense populations with devastating effect. Climate shifts can collapse entire regional systems. In many cases, the archaeological record reveals settlements abandoned abruptly, their people vanished without clear explanation. These disappearances remind us that civilization, however impressive, is fragile. Yet fragility does not halt progress. Over centuries, humans refine farming techniques, expand trade, fortify cities, diversify tools, codify beliefs, and build connections that span continents. Agriculture feeds populations large enough to support craftspeople, soldiers, administrators, and scholars. This diversification accelerates innovation exponentially. Art flourishes. Pottery with intricate designs, figurines sculpted with symbolic purpose, carvings etched with cosmological meaning, early musical instruments crafted with care. The human impulse to express beauty, belief, fear, and awe becomes central to community identity. As populations grow, early states begin to form, political entities defined by boundaries, leadership, and centralized resources. These proto-states often arise around fertile valleys, trade hubs, or ritual centers. Their leaders claim legitimacy through ancestry, spiritual authority, or military strength. With statehood comes monumental architecture, pyramids, stepped platforms, megalithic structures, ceremonial enclosures. These structures serve practical, ritual, and symbolic purposes. They are expressions of collective effort and collective identity. They mark the emergence of human ambition on a scale that echoes through millennia. But monumental structures also reveal something else. Humanity is learning to think beyond individuals and lifetimes. These buildings require planning that spans generations. They require organizing labor, engineering solutions, and integrating ideology into physical space. Cities grow larger, streets widen, marketplaces expand, storage systems become more complex, governance systems evolve, written records grow thicker, laws emerge to regulate property, inheritance, trade, and justice. And yet, the deeper we look into the archaeological record of early civilization, the more we sense what is missing. The laughter of children, the emotions behind rituals, the arguments between neighbors, the dreams of individuals whose names were never written, the fears that shaped decisions, the personal stories erased by time. Civilization rises not from monuments, but from daily actions: cooking, crafting, farming, healing, storytelling, building, negotiating. And most of these actions vanish without a trace. Still, despite the gaps, the trajectory is unmistakable. Humanity is accelerating. The feedback loop between population growth, innovation, and cultural exchange becomes exponential. As societies become more complex, they develop calendars, astronomical knowledge, taxation systems, legal courts, mythologies, and political hierarchies. They expand their territories. They defend borders. They form alliances and wage wars. These early conflicts are part of the story, too. They reshape regions, disperse populations, spread technologies through conquest or diaspora. But even warfare leaves a sparse record. Broken weapons, burned layers, scattered bones, collapsed walls. The motivations, strategies, and consequences remain largely speculative. As the Holocene progresses, climate continues to influence human development. Periods of drought challenge societies to innovate or collapse. Floods reaffirm the power of rivers. Shifting coastlines force migrations, yet through every shift, humanity adapts, learns, innovates. By the time written history finally emerges in full, Sumerian cuneiform tablets, Egyptian hieroglyphs, early Chinese oracle bones, the world is already dense with stories that will never be recorded. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Technologies have been discovered, lost, and rediscovered. Belief systems have taken shape in shadows now unreachable. History, as we know it, begins only after most of the human story has already passed. But this final chapter before recorded history ends on a profound note. Humanity has become the dominant force shaping ecosystems, landscapes, and eventually the future of the planet. The seeds of everything recognizable, cities, states, writing, art, religion, science, conflict, architecture, trade, myth, have taken root. Civilization is no longer an experiment. It is the path forward. And with the dawn of written language, humanity steps into the light of its own memory, carrying with it tens of thousands of years of trial, triumph, adaptation, imagination, survival, and silence. Everything to come. Empires, philosophies, religions, technologies, wars, wonders will rise from the foundation laid during these invisible millennia. Time's long silence ends.